Hi, this is Caroline Monteleone, and you're listening to my friend Matthew Shapiro's podcast, Six Wheels Consulting.
Nice.
Welcome to the Sixth Wheels Consulting Podcast, dialoguing disability and discussing difference, inclusion, and all abilities in today's world. Now here are your hosts, Matthew Shapiro and Bob Nolly.
Hey now, welcome back. This is Bob Nolly with Matthew Shapiro, and you found your way back to the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. Hey, today, Matthew and Odile Carroll are going to continue their conversation. So let's get right to
it. In addition to this, you and I have had many impassioned conversations similar to this, so much so that we are trying to potentially write an essay or an article or something. You and I really haven't framed it out yet, around this whole idea of sort of challenging society as a whole and even the disability community itself to try to think about itself differently. And I think it touches on a lot of what you've been saying in terms of disenfranchisement, sort of status quo, all of those things. Can you kind of go into a little bit more detail too about what we're thinking on that front?
Right. I think that, the notes that I've at least taken from our conversations as I'm in the process of typing, working on something now, is kind of coming back to this tension, or really this, like, where are we now in this moment? Are in some ways we're moving forward as if the era of disability rights in the 80s and 90s, as if the Americans with Disabilities Act, as if all of those movements have kind of finished or met the goals that they had set forth, or they had requested, and that, in some ways kind of ideologically we're moving more towards a disability justice framework, right, which is placing disability within things like sexism, within things like transphobia, within other social justice movements. But I think Matthew and I have really come up at this interesting tension, which is these are in many other histories of social justice or other social movements, the rights kind of precedes the justice, right? It's like a step that gets to the second step, but within this community in particular, there has been no success or no kind of, we've hit all of the marks that we've been looking for. All the goals that we set in 1990 have been achieved, and now we can move, into, like, we now have gained access,
right?
And now we can kind of blow up the system, and approach it from a justice framework. And the fact that really neither of those are in tension, but neither are moving forward, have moved forward. There's still so many roadblocks.
Right.
I think that there's sometimes, like, there's a little bit of, like, we could bring more awareness to where we are.
Well, and I've been sort of pounding the table, and Bob, you know this as well from our many episodes together, pounding the table in terms of saying, like, all right, let's do more as a community. Let's because to your point, Odile, it's a matter of all right, so we've had the ADA for 25, 26 more years, but yet we still have the same challenges that we had back then. Like, yes, it is a little bit better. I would say it's a lot better, but you still have those situations where buildings don't have to be made accessible, and there's really no level of, I would argue, like, true accountability from an ADA standpoint to, like, mandate that all buildings are accessible. But even beyond that, it is like, there are still all of these societal barriers, whether it be, to our earlier conversation, lack of housing opportunities, or lack of employment opportunities, or transportation, healthcare, any number of things that were issues before the ADA was passed, I would say are still issues now. And I'm always finding myself around tables having these exact same conversations and wondering, okay, what are we doing to really either call attention to these and say, are we going to stop talking about them and actually do something about them? And are we actually seeing significant change where maybe the issue of housing is no longer an issue, or is it just going to continue to be, long-term issues that no one wants to deal with? And I guess my question would be, why do you think we're still in sort of this, why are we in this cycle where nothing gets accomplished?
I mean, I think that as long as you continue to disenfranchise, I think that voting, like the political system and the way that it's like, how do you propose change, or how do you incentivize change that isn't related to, someone's pure financial contribution? Or, I mean, this is, perhaps I'm giving away my cynicism of the system, but I think that you're continuing to disenfranchise voices, and those disenfranchised voices are speaking up, but they're not given volume, right? They're not given the megaphone because they have not been given power, and power has the strongest or the loudest vote. And so it's this cyclical problem.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. If I can jump in here for just a second.
Yeah,
I had a discussion with an academic colleague who was presenting to me the philosophy that for true change to happen, the pendulum of social unrest needs to swing very negatively. And then on that down sweep in the other direction, that's when change really happens. And he went back to, the Civil War in the United States and pointed out 3 things that suggested that. So now, I'm not saying this is as big as the Civil War, but in these times of, I'll just call it political unrest, that pendulum, no matter what side of the fence you're on, is swinging in a negative direction. And when it comes forward again, is there an opportunity here for many people, including the disability community, to make those changes that you all have described?
Well, if I could jump in real quick, and then I'll certainly pass it over to you too. But my thought with that question, Bob, is I would hope that would be the case, but I often wonder if it will be. And I make that statement because even a lot of our social justice movements that we have today, are they accessible, and are they open to people with disabilities? And by accessible, I mean, do you have your marches or whatever in places that can be accessed by people with disabilities? Do you have accommodations for those people to be able to participate in those movements? Does somebody have an interpreter available to them if they needed it? In a lot of the social justice movements I have seen, I have not really seen a lot of people with disabilities on the front line, so to speak. And so I wonder, and Odile, I don't know what kind of thoughts you have on that front as well. Odile, I think you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes.
got you.
Great, cool. Sorry, I was muted. I was muting to cough, so
No,
I could just edit that part out.
Done.
So I think I totally agree. And I think that it's also that's a fair observation, or there's a true observation about the reverse too, which is what the disability justice conversation interrogates, which is, and then are the maybe few disability advocacy moments, or whether it's protest, whether it's conversation, any sort of engagement in social justice or advocacy as it relates to disability, are those also inclusive to all, like, people of color, like right. What is the gender, in terms of gendered access and sexism, or like trans people with disabilities, so I think that there's that siloing, right? Where it's like, what does inclusion look like in both of these camps? Not only for other movements of social justice, the March on Washington for, environmental activism and those accessibility needs, and also, disability events that are gathering, are those, accessible among other ways that we think about, like, or not accessible, I guess, inclusion, racial inclusion, gender inclusion, sexuality, inclusion of sexuality, all of those. So I think that
it's even like, I can't even think of a situation where, like, I've seen social justice movements like advertised on, say, like Facebook or other social media platforms, and like you wonder. I haven't seen it where they're advertised and it's like, yes, people with disabilities are welcome, kind of thing. Now maybe they don't do that because, like, maybe it's assumed, but maybe that's like part of the problem too, because it's like, if you don't know that you're in a space that's going to be accessible and inclusive to you, are you are you willing to go be part of that march or do that social justice movement thing? I don't know the answer to that. And like, I guess in my experience, like, I've not really taken part in quote unquote marches before. But I wonder if that's because I'm skeptical that they're going to be accessible to me. I don't know.
Right. And I think, of course, it's kind of going back to what you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation as well. What is people's awareness of accessibility in the first place? I mean, I can speak very personally to being a teaching assistant in a university system and having a relationship with the disability center as it comes to accommodation for whatever disability, for whatever student, whatever the circumstances of the student. And I can tell you, that someone's version of, like, pretty much the overarching accessibility offering with our, massive state university system is basically more time on an exam. Right. And that's kind of just handed out. And you think about, how does that match someone's experience of learning, someone's experience of being able to get to a classroom, someone's whatever. You're pretty much just handed more time. And so even just our understanding of what accessibility and what options even do look like appears to be really limited in a lot of places.
That's a really interesting point. And Bob, I actually want to get your take on this too, because I know you are a professor and you do grading and things. But like, I think about that from my standpoint. Like, I had, when I was at school, like, I had extended time on tests, and like, I took my test in a quiet area. But like, I also wonder, like, is there not other ways that we could be giving tests to students? Because like, I know I am primarily an auditory learner, right? Which means I have to hear things in order to process information. So why could one not do like an interview style exam where I'm literally having a conversation with somebody and like answering the questions that they're giving me based on that conversation? Like, why could we not pivot the educational system to like, and there are other challenges within the educational system, but like, using this test example as the one, since Odile, you brought it up, why could we not like do tests based on the learning style or the need of the student? Interesting theory. I don't know, as the two, I was in academia as a student, but I'm not further in academia like the two of you are. If either of you have thoughts on that, I'd be curious to hear about it.
But in my take, I'll just jump in first. When I set up an assessment instrument, whether it be an exam or a quiz or a paper or whatever, I'm just, and this is me personally, I'm just bent on making sure I give them an opportunity to present and develop their critical thinking skills.
Sure.
Now, that having been said, I'm coming out of the business environment in the org behavior arena, which has some ties to psychology. But I students that just go, I'm going to be late for this exam, I'm fine with that. I will accommodate, and of course, their tardiness is not anywhere nearly the kind of thing that needs to be accommodated that we discuss on this show here. But
Right.
I'm going, yeah, that's fine. When will you get this to me? And I want you to be able to say when you're going to be able to get your work done. And I want that work with evidence. I want you to have the opportunity to, press your critical thinking skills. And, the oral exam type of option is reasonable to me. Is it more expensive? Yeah, sure. But for me, the professor, for me, the one that's committed to helping you create successes for you going forward in your life, not just your career, I'm willing to incur some of that expense.
Right. Odile, any thoughts on that yourself?
Yeah, I echo Bob's feelings in that I also try and really challenge the way that we think about participation. And, it's perhaps a little trickier for me. I mean, we're both still dealing with bureaucratic systems in many ways, but I'm never the lead. I'm not the professor of the course. I'm the teaching assistant. So my capacity to change a lot of the syllabus or the basic requirements of the class is harder. But at least in the classroom, I teach every week for all the classes that I've ever been a TA for. I have a weekly discussion section. And it's in that discussion section that I think I really try and expand on the definition and expectation of participation in a learning environment. So often, as you all both know, and not something I think you probably ever struggled with, Matthew, but participation can be a big chunk of someone's grade, and it can also be a really challenging, both a kind of ambiguous and challenging thing to assess, and perhaps for many students a really nerve-wracking experience, depending on your relationship to school, depending on your ability or need or accommodation or lack thereof. That in itself can, we label it so often as being verbal participation in a classroom, your capacity to raise your hand and engage critically in front of your peers. So I at least try at the beginning of the quarter to offer, 10 or 15 different ways that I count participation, which can
and that's even tricky in itself too, right? Because we all know I'm really good at talking. I like to do that. But when I was in that college environment, it was tricky to know when, all right, is it right for me to jump in here? Do I sound stupid if I make this comment? Like, this is how I'm processing this information. Does this comment add to the debate we're currently having? And because so much of one's grade is tied to that, if you're a student with a learning disability or a disability of any kind, that makes it more intimidating. And then when you have to, because the other aspect for me is I had and have test anxiety, so that when I was taking an exam or I have to learn information and memorize it, I know it backwards and forwards when I'm studying and when I'm practicing. But 9 times out of 10, when I was taking a test, my mom described my brain as like a whiteboard. I would know all the material before the test, feel very confident in it, and then I would get on the test and I would completely just lose all knowledge of whatever that topic was. And so, I was not doing well on that exam or on that paper because I just had moments where the test anxiety kind of got the best of me. But it, again, that goes where if you frame the academic, how one gets graded, whether it be verbal, whatever your learning style is, if you frame it in a way that helps that person's learning style, if you're learning that material, in my opinion, it shouldn't matter how one gets tested on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that so many people who arrive, or engage in academic spaces with a lot of anxiety, which I can identify as being one of those people too. I think so much of it also stems from memories or situations where the system itself wasn't fair or kind to you, and so when you arrive at a test, or when I arrive, in my case, writing is really anxiety producing activity. I deeply understand the irony of that statement as I am writing a thesis right now, but as I've chosen to do this, but it's something I work on every day. But I think that I can root it back. It's not even relevant to whether or not I know the information, but it's rooted into my insecurities that stem from, the system not really kind of having room for the way that I learned in a classroom, in like an English classroom, and the way that I did this. And so I think that, again, it kind of comes back to that system. It's not your individual response tells me more about the system's approach than it does anything, being wrong with you. It's like, it's like the ableism is just that, however you're looking at it, it's not the impairment of the person, or it's not their specific individual, whatever personality or preference. It's the way that the system is there's a gap between.
Right. And I think that comes back to like the whole overarching conversation of what I think you and I are trying to write about in our like essay. I don't know what we're calling it. It might be an essay, might be, I don't know. We haven't really decided yet, but it's a matter of like, okay, how can we approach like all of these systemic issues, again, whether it's academia, transportation, how can we reframe how we think about, talk about, and deal with this topic of disability? Because we again, I feel like we're in a status quo situation. And so somebody, whether that's Odile and myself or somebody else, has to be willing to say, like, hold on, one, why are we comfortable with this? And two, what are we doing to make it better and to try and change it? And so that's really what the whole crux, at least from my viewpoint, is of what Odile and I are working on in terms of this essay. Or again, I don't know what it will be, but I think that is the heart of the problem of like, why are we cool with remaining in the status quo of disability culture? Why are we not, and by we, I mean, why is the disability community not forcing the hand more, not only of policymakers, but anyone in a decision-making position, to change the way we view disability? That I think that's kind of the global question.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? You and I, this is episode 41 for us right now, right? We talk about this every night. Right. That's our goal every night. This is what we're talking about.
Right. And so, what are we doing? Like, what I Odile laughs at me all the time because I often say, like, what are we doing? What are we doing to how are we making change, right? And how are we moving the ball forward as a community? Not only those of us who live with disabilities, but I definitely now consider. I mean, obviously, Odile, you have your connection with your uncle, and Bob, you and I have been doing this podcast for 41 episodes now. I definitely feel like you are also now part of the community based on the conversations we have. Like, what are we doing to see some significant change in the matter of housing, or in the matter of accommodations, or really anything that affects people with disabilities in this world? And that is a question we have not been able to answer. And I guess that's kind of what Odile and I are kind of trying to think about with this article we're writing, but then also trying to provide a call to action. I mean, Odile, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I know that call to action piece was huge for us.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. I do think that these kind of micro, like it's a micro and a macro approach, and that I do think those micro changes and what you can offer, for example, in what Bob offers to his students, or what I try and offer to my students, language, approaches to language, all of those kind of conversations or interactions on a daily basis where you are able to kind of infuse that perspective or knowledge to the extent that you have the, emotional energy to do so. I do think that that's always a critical point that people continue to take. And also, it's not at the expense of reestablishing the macro, right? And reforming systems so that it's not about finding a seat at the table or pushing for a seat at the table, but redesigning who's at the table entirely.
But I think part of that is the crux of your and my debate on a regular basis, right? Because you can't have the micro without the macro. Mm-hmm. And so how do you balance the two so that we can make those small changes, but then also see the big element changes so that, we're not having a policymaker who, quote unquote, is saying he's writing a disability policy, but it's really not a disability policy, but they're framing it in that way.
Right.
It's the chicken or the egg situation.
Right. And again, it's the chicken or egg situation. It again comes back to that disenfranchisement, because chances are Andrew Yang's table probably doesn't have anyone who's got a connection to this community or these issues or has that perspective. And then therefore he gets away with saying, yeah, sure, this is disability policy.
Right.
Because there's no one at the table. I mean, you see this all the time, whether it's, again, disability, whether it's racial justice, whether it's, trans rights. Like it's we know who the decision makers are, and we know who their influences are. And it's not actually, many times, not actually the people being most affected by it. So, yeah, no, I completely agree. The micro and macro are not mutually exclusive directions.
So let me ask you this: we're getting ready to end up our time here, but I just want to ask you this: in your research that you're doing now, and all the research you're doing for your thesis, I don't want you to insert bias here, of course, but what do you expect to find?
So I mean,
what have you found? Either way.
So I can tell you a little bit about, just to kind of frame more specifically how I'm researching. So what I'm looking at the final rules effect on the everyday living of Camp Hill communities, this one in Vermont in particular. So I'm looking more at people's capacity to build and maintain social relationships, people's capacity to engage with advocacy or to advocate for themselves, to be involved in advocacy in some capacity, people's capacity to engage with outside community, this kind of engage with choice. But I'm looking at that in a more everyday living. So I'm looking at it in the home. I'm looking at it in the community. I'm doing interviews. I'm doing observations. And doing a little bit of content analysis of some pieces of literature. And I would say that my argument, to keep it less theory heavy.
Let's nerd out right now.
Yeah, to keep it less light on the theory. But I'm essentially looking for a way that Camp Hill communities can articulate or translate themselves in the work that they're doing in a way to the state that is within the state's language, using the state's language, but is a completely different form of knowledge and knowledge making that should have a right to exist. So it's saying that the end purpose of Camp Hill is not to just reform itself to look exactly like a state, funded group home. That's never going to be the goal of a Camp Hill community. That's not what it should strive to be. But how are the ways that it can do a better job at translating itself, right, at articulating itself to the funding source, because there's a necessary relationship there, without sacrificing so many of these key elements, which I'm arguing lie in the everyday living at Camp Hill, without sacrificing those to maintain this environment, to be an environment, the same environment that many people, made the choice to live in. So it's not, it's the big recommendations on, like, what do we do about how do we fix this problem globally is something I'm still definitely grappling with, but I'm looking more at the effects on, like, home life and social relationships and everything on a bit of, I guess, more of a micro and macro.
And ideally, in the long run, it certainly is a hope, I'm sure, that you will inspire the researchers that come after you to follow and do more work on this very topic. You know, if any of our listeners want to reach out and find you in the Twitter sphere or wherever you reside in social, where can they find you?
God, I don't really have much of a media presence.
That's right. You're a graduate student writing a thesis. I don't do any of that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to link my email if people wanted. I'm on LinkedIn. I guess maybe that's the way.
Yeah, that's the way to go there. Sure.
Yeah, okay.
That's an adult way to do it.
That's an adult way to do it.
And when I'll also be sure to share with our listeners, whatever Odile and I come up with in terms of, again, we don't know. We're as everyone I hope has figured out through this conversation, both she and I are very fired up about this whole kind of global thought process around disability. And so we're not really sure how, whether it'll be an article, whether it will be an essay. We haven't figured that out yet, but we are trying to do something so that we can maybe start to try and be that duo or some people that start to challenge that status quo. So as soon as we have something that we can share with our listeners, Odile, one thing that Bob always likes to share is once you've been a guest on our show, you are always a member of our...
You're a co-host now. You're a co-host. Congratulations.
Yes. Yes. So,
what an honor.
Whenever we get whatever we're doing done, maybe we can have you back on and we can sort of debate further what we came up with and whether we think it's right, wrong, or a bunch of malarkey. Who knows?
It's even better than that. She can just dial us up anytime and go, get me on again.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So once I'm done with my thesis, we can do my results.
We'll do a lot of that. Hey, Odile, you and Matthew in your conversation tonight have really put a very nice new perspective in the conversation we've been having here on this issue. Thank you very much for that. I know as a proponent and as an academic, I'll be the first in line on ProQuest or wherever when you publish your thesis. So congratulations on the work that you've done so far and everything you're going to do in the future. Thank you for being with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. Keep rolling forward. Think inclusion. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.